Let's see the next question, which says, what is the difference between a mistake, a defect, and a failure? So the person can make an error or mistake. So the developer, for example, is writing his code. While he is writing this code, he might implement a functionality in a wrong way. Also, the product owner, he might write a wrong requirement. He might also write a wrong acceptance criteria for a user story. So this is considered as an error or a mistake. So like we see here, a person can make an error or mistake which can lead to the introduction of a defect, fault, or bug. So the error is the same as the mistake, and this error leads to a defect or a fault or a bug, and those are the same thing, okay? This defect happens in the software code or in some other related work product. So for example, the product owner misunderstood the requirements. He wrote a wrong user story, okay? In this case, this user story includes a defect that is based on the error or the mistake that the product owner has done. The error that happens in this work product, which is the requirements, for example, in this case, can lead to an error in another work product. So like we said, the product owner made an error. This error caused a defect in the user stories or the product backlog. And this defect caused an error done by the developer, okay? The developer read the user stories or the product backlog and began to implement them in a wrong way. So this is another error or mistake which will lead to a defect in the software itself, okay? In the system that will go to the tester in order to find defects in it. So like we see here, an error that leads to the introduction of a defect in one work product can trigger an error that leads to the introduction of a defect in a related work product or in another work product. For example, a requirements recitation error can lead to a requirements defect, which then results in programming error that leads to a defect in the code. And this is why sometimes we use root cause analysis in order to know the root errors that caused this defect. The defect that happens in the requirements or in the code can lead to the failure, but this will happen if this code is executed. Not all defects cause failures, okay? So the defect might be inside the code, it might still there, but the scenario that reveals this defect is not very easy. In this way, this defect will not cause a failure. But if the scenario that shows the defect happens, in this case, a failure might happen to the software. So like we see here, if a defect in the code is executed, this may cause a failure, but not necessarily in all circumstances. For example, some defects require very specific inputs or preconditions to trigger a failure, which may occur rarely or never. The next question says, what are the most important components of a defect report? So writing a defect report or a bug report or a fault report, like we said, the defect is the same as the bug and it is the same as a fault. Writing a good defect report is one of the most important skills that you must possess as a software tester. But how can you write a good defect report? This is something that the interviewer must make sure that you are able to do. The defect report includes many fields. And those fields might, for example, be like 20 different fields, okay? But what are the most important fields or components of the defect report? So in order to write a good defect report, you must not forget to write any of those things or those fields. The first is the title, and the title should be simple and should be descriptive. For example, you don't say login doesn't work, okay? But what you should say is that login submit button doesn't work, okay? Or isn't clickable. In this way, you are more specific. You need to provide steps to reproduce the defect with all the data necessary to reproduce this defect. You need to provide the expected result and the actual result, and of course they are different than each other. You also need to provide the priority of the defect, is it high priority, medium or low, and you need to provide a proof, okay, something that proves that this defect happened with you. And this thing can be a screenshot, okay, and it can be also a video. So like we said, the defect report includes more than those fields, but those are the most important fields that you cannot write a good defect report without providing them. Another important question is, what is risk-based testing? So risk-based testing, or RBT, is a software testing type that is based on the probability of the risk. So in risk-based testing, we prioritize our test cases based on their risks. So first, we begin to assess our risks based on the software complexity, the criticality of the business, the frequency of use, and the possible areas that might include defects. And like we said, risk-based testing prioritizes testing of features and functions of the software which are more impactful and likely to have defects. So if a function has a high impact on the software, it will have a higher level of risk. If it is likely to have more defects, it also will have a higher risk. So what are the steps that risk-based testing goes through? The first step is to identify the risks in your product. Then you begin to analyze those risks. Then you begin to prioritize them. And after prioritizing your risks, you begin to create test cases or a test plan to mitigate those risks.